parents, the child goes to the teacher who will guide that child.
What do you mean by external moral authority? You use that expression a lot.
Materialism has to do with when you are
Hello, you are listening to the course in Values and Spirituality. Today we will be looking at the subject of human values, having just covered the subject of universal or spiritual values in the last episode. I am here in the studio with Sister Denise, who's the author of these 8 books that we are covering in the series. Sister Denise, it's fabulous to have you back.
Thank you.
When we went through the subject of universal values, you told the audience that you are now calling this spiritual values. Today's subject is human values. Does this title stay the same, or has this changed also?
You know, my thinking at this time is that in those days, the idea of universal values, human values, temporal values was very current among the people who think about these things. But what I have come to conclude nowadays is that these classifications are in a sense artificial. They're a bit theoretical. And when something is theoretical and artificial like that, we give it validity that it doesn't really have. So while it's nice and tidy to talk about universal values, human values, temporal values, and it goes through the 3 stages, it's not pragmatic, it's not practical in the same way. But human values, yes, human values, we can say that, but when we go later to the specific categories of values, I think they're a bit more real than these. Because this human values, we have idealized it. And because it's been idealized, it's not really usable in practical life.
So when it comes to the development of values and the cultivation of values, is the onus on one to sow the seeds of understanding and then water it with your attention, plow the field, cultivate it? Is that how it grows?
I still feel that there is a merging of the idea of qualities and virtues with values. And you can see in the sentence here, values like cooperation, honesty, humility, responsibility, simplicity, and unity. To me, I don't really consider them to be values, but they would be powers, they would be virtues, they would be qualities. And this is why I tend to prefer the term principles, because it's clearer when you use the word principle that I hold or I espouse a certain principle, and then the various different qualities go with those principles. If you say human values, and you understand by that, okay, I give importance to the human being, human rights, human dignity, like that. And then you give priority to those things. Because what I am finding is what people say is a lack of values. It's not a lack of values, it's a conflict of values. So there are some people who will say it is more important to give rights to people and to respect the rights of people. Then other people will say, no, that's not so important. It's more important to think about money, for example. And there's a conflict between the values associated with giving respect to a human being, considering life to be sacred, considering a human being to be valuable. You know, we have this expression, life is cheap. People don't care about those who do not hold position, power, property, and so on, you see. And we have mixed it up with these ideals, and we've made qualities into ideals and values, and so we talk about it in a nice way, but it doesn't lend itself to practical application. And then people say, well, nobody has any values. But I think deep down it's because the way we think about it and the way we talk about it sabotages the aim of bringing these different qualities into the human experience. So when we go later to talk about, corporate values, material values, mathematical values, that really is values. But this ideal of universal human and temporal values has, I think, confused people in how they think about values and caused us to get stuck.
How would you say that human values differs from what we were talking about yesterday, universal and/or spiritual values? How would you draw the distinction?
Well, again, I would say that it's an artificial distinction, because if you say universal values, then you say, well, that's spiritual values, and a human being is a spiritual being anyway. So in that sense, to value the spirit, to value the human being is something very important to do, and then after that you look at the different values, because you see the whole thing of my current thinking about values is that it's a matter of prioritizing. And so if you say, okay, the universal principles are more valuable than the human beings, but the universal principles is an idea. A human being is something real, you see. And then you put ideas and people like that, and the ideas are created by people. You could look at it in a different way. You could say, okay, God, truth, everything that God represents is higher than a human being, and that would be true, but it's very difficult for a human being to conceptualize God, so that makes it an ideal. It's not practical.
You start off this paragraph with the words, human values ensure the harmonious continuity of civilized life. What did you mean by that expression?
If you give value to the human being and you respect human life, human rights, and so on, and you call that human values, you're not actually using the term in the same way. This is why I say that this is really an effect, and the writing of these three sections is very much an effect of going along with the morality which creates a philosophy that says there is such a thing as a hierarchy of universal, then human, then temporal. But my current thinking is that that idea is not real, it's not practical, it's artificial. So if I would be writing this again, I wouldn't write it like this, But I think it's important for us to be talking about this, because the energy of social attitudes that comes to people to make them think that there is such a thing as human values and there is such a thing as universal values confuses them. So I think in order to come out of that confusion, you need to know what the confusion is, why it's in there, who put it in there, why they put it in there, and what was the consequences. And those consequences being moral confusion invalidates that style of thinking. And because it's so subtle, people just didn't get it. And at the time of writing, we also didn't get it. In the process of writing these materials, myself and my editor, Rose Kelly, we were really having difficulty making sense of these widely and highly held ideas, and we were finding that they're not real, they don't work. We even had to come away from the idea of right and wrong, good and bad, and we ended up with discordant and harmonious, because those words that are used by everyone all over the place, across all the cultures, create moral confusion.
In what way?
Well, someone will say, well, this and this and this is bad. This person exhibits these qualities, therefore this person is classified as a bad person, a subhuman, you see. So what I mean to say is that this form of thinking, this style of moral philosophy, you can say, leads to prejudice, double standards,
Judgments.
and, yes, value judgments, and we are now challenging that. And nobody challenged it before. So it's new.
Okay. If one spends a rather large amount of time trying to understand values, going into the depths of it, studying this text, what does one stand to gain from it?
What you stand to gain from it is you start to think clearly. And if you think clearly, then you know what to do and what not to do, and you don't get any surprises. That when you are making a decision about what action you will perform, you understand all the ramifications, you know where it's going, and then you can function with a lot more autonomy, and you cannot be manipulated. So you have that possibility to maintain your integrity. And it means that your karma will be exactly what you expect it to be, what you think it is. Where you have this creating confusion, it sends you off in the wrong direction. You think you're doing something right, and then you wonder why it doesn't work out, you see. And it's really only now that by unpacking this whole concept of values that we see how much flawed logic there is, how much flawed thinking there is, which has been handed down for actually thousands of years. And why it carried on unchallenged is because of the idea that males are higher than females by definition, and then we challenge that by saying, well, no, because the person is not a male or a female, the person is a spiritual being, you see. And that changed everything. The other thing that changed everything is that God is not something that human beings can define. So for centuries, God has been defined according to the convenience of the patriarchal elite. And if those definitions were true, there's no problem. But now we're finding that those definitions are not true, and you have the being of God presenting his self as not the way he has been presented by humans, because in the hierarchy, God being the highest, then humanity, then, mammals and reptiles and insects and whatever the hierarchy is, human beings can understand more or less what's below. They can't understand what's above, so they made it up. And this is part of that, you can say, imaginary concept. And if they had got it right, it would have been successful. What we've seen over the course of many centuries is that because they didn't get it right, it didn't work. And our present situation is, well, if it didn't work, then we don't need it. And what we want is something that does work. And you remember when we were talking earlier about this question of the commissions created by the Indian government, saying, our problem is we have a values problem. No doubt, we do have a values problem, that's correct. And then they request people to create a syllabus for teaching values to people. But the syllabus is based on flawed philosophy, and because of that, it doesn't work. And my and Rose's work has been to see, why doesn't it work? See, previously, nobody ever thought that it didn't work. But we said, look, if it worked, why do you want another one? That means it doesn't work. And we didn't want to write something that doesn't work. It's a waste of our time. So what makes it work? What makes it not work? And so we are very fortunate to have been given this spiritual knowledge that describes what a soul is, that describes a detail of God in a lot more detail than we've had so far, that describes the philosophy of karma. So we had new information to bring to the table. So when you bring new information, it changes everything. In a way, it's comparable to what happened in science, with the discoveries that were made in the 20s, and then other discoveries that were made in the 1970s, called new science, and now more discoveries are being made, which means that the way people think about the material world and the laws of the material world are drastically changing. And technology that's been created out of this has changed how we interact with each other. The internet has existed for the public since about 1981 or something. And anybody who's born after that, including all the millennials and everything, they have no idea what was life without internet. No idea. And the way we function now, and the way my parents' generation functions, is like the 12th century to the 20th century, and yet in the space of 100 years, 50 years, 20 years, the epochal change has been so drastic, but yet in terms of the moral philosophy, there hasn't been that drastic change, except for the fact that we've had this new information coming in, which means we can challenge conventional wisdom. And that means we have to really think, okay, now what do we do?
In this section, you speak of human values as being subject to change. Is that still your view? As opposed to universal values that are constant?
I think the value of a human being is being looked at differently now, because in the modern world we consider that interfaith dialogue is positive. Now, previously that was considered as anathema. In most societies, the idea of slavery was considered all right, the idea of owning a person. And then you can use that person however you want. And because so many people were abused in those situations and continue to be, we're now saying the concept of ownership of a person is flawed, and we cannot go with that anymore. So the thinking about what a human being is and what human rights are and the relative value of human beings, the principle of racism is embedded in the religions. And we have a clash of values here where the principle of human rights comes in conflict with the principle of ownership, the principle of racism, and so on, because we're seeing that if you accept that those principles, which were considered very high values a few 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, if you think that that's right, then it wouldn't be causing human suffering, you see. And the fundamental principle of why there is moral philosophy in the first place is to resolve the question of human suffering. So if you say morality is to take out human suffering, but slavery is good, then that doesn't fit. And so what we're able to do now, which I think people weren't able to do before, due to the existence of the new spiritual knowledge that's come in now, is we can challenge what couldn't be challenged before. And when you challenge something so fundamental as these traditions that have been passed down through the ancestors, that there has never been any challenge so big as this. And it's a real challenge to humanity itself, because now we have brought ourselves, to the brink of self-destruction. Humanity can go just like that if they decide to have a nuclear war or something. And so we're really facing, what have we thought, what have we done, what do we do now? And I think when you have a course of study in these circumstances, where you're really looking at the clash between what people have thought all along is true and honorable and right, but then the consequences do not bear that up. And so now, new thought. And when something new comes up, is incredibly great resistance, because people don't know, is this real? This doubt, And people prefer the hell they know to the heaven they don't know.
Yes. What message would you now want the reader and the viewer to gain from what you have to say today, as opposed to 16 years ago, on the subject of human values?
I think the message is, take a good look at yourself and ask yourself, why are you valuable? Why is life sacred? What makes it sacred? These are very fundamental questions. You ask yourself, okay, what am I? Am I a woman? Am I a spirit? Am I my nationality? Am I my race? Really ask yourself this question, is that or is it not what I am? Because all of these value systems have been based on the principle that a person is their gender, their race, their religion, their caste. And what we're looking at in this study is that may not be the case. And so you're really looking at this question for your own self. Because first we have to decide for the self, what am I? And once you've decided that for yourself, then when you look at another human being, you can't look at them as their race or their caste or their religion or their gender. You have to look at them as this is a human spirit. This is a human being, this is a child of God. And what the corollary is that I cannot treat a person as if it's an object.
Do we do that?
Well, that's exactly what we do.
In what way?
Say you have a war situation, and in the world today there are many. We say, I can kill this person because of their nationality.
Give me a domestic example.
I can beat this person because it says in the scriptures that it's a good idea to beat your wife or your children, because that will make them good. And what we're seeing is it's not true. You cannot bring in this kind of change overnight. And people have been thinking about this for several decades, but the actual shift from a human being as a thing to a human being as a someone, which has nothing to do with their race or their religion or their caste or their gender, that is so new, and people are very reluctant. Who will bring in change like this? It is thought leaders. So in a sense, what we're doing, you and I, discussing these things, is presenting new ideas and saying, yeah, these ideas stand up, they can be sustained, they can be represented, they can be, you know, there is an expression, apologist, and it's a bit of an ancient expression, but what it means is that you can represent the idea, you can prove it, you see. Then you're challenging the conventional wisdom which people have a loyalty to. And whether something's true or false, if you have a loyalty to it, and then it's shown to you that that's false, that's a challenge to you, you see, and you will react to that. So I think that we have to sort of allow the ideas to percolate and to sink in, and to say, okay, well, in case perhaps this might be true, what difference does it make to how I think about myself? And then if I think about myself differently, it's much easier to think differently about other people. And there is a transition period where everything is destabilized. So in a transition period of destabilization, you yourself have to be stable.
I do wish that this has caused some ripple or impact in your life, and I invite you to join us for the next episode, where we will explore the subject and other related subjects on values and spirituality further. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care and goodbye.